I'm just going to share my screen now. Okay. All right, yeah, so as Sonali said, I'm a PhD student in the HECT lab at Harvard University. I consider myself an evolutionary neuroscientist, but also an ethologist, which means I study both behavior and also neuroanatomy. And in particular, I mostly study domestic dog breeds, just like the ones that live in your homes. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about the science that is out there currently on how and why dogs play, as well as how it evolved, in addition to kind of featuring the Paw Game study, which is a citizen science initiative that my lab is currently running, that I am leading, where we are trying to further learn about the mechanisms of dog play and the factors that influence it. And on the title screen here, you'll see two of our past participants from that study. So Molly the boxer and Taff the border collie. Taff was actually our, I think, either our first or our second participant. So special shout out to him. Oh, sorry. Okay, so just so we know where we're going, here are the topics of discussion for today. So first I'm going to talk about what play behavior actually is. Then I'll talk a little bit about how it might have evolved, what it looks like in the brain, how your dog might play and what that might mean. And then finally, I will discuss the Paw Game study, which is still looking for participants. So keep that in mind while you watch. Okay, so first off, what even is play? So it's kind of hard to describe play, although it's pretty obvious to tell what play is when you look at it. But there have been multiple definitions in the literature, and it's kind of the consensus that play is a modified serious behavior. So here you see a whippet or a greyhound chasing a ball on the left, and then you can see how similar it is to this chasing behavior of a hare on the right. The behavior on the right is, of course, a natural instinct for survival, hunting prey, whereas on the left, it's been modified for this playful context. And one key feature of play is often that it involves variable movements. So sometimes it can be really jerky, sometimes, you know, the animal might mix up different routines and things like that. And importantly, play behavior is always a means rather than an end. So unlike when a dog is chasing a rabbit, where the importance of that behavior is actually capturing the hare, for the greyhound on the left, it's more of a means because the behavior itself is rewarding. So that's another feature that's commonly used to describe what counts as play. And another way to kind of get a feel for what play behavior is that it's typically whatever you see frequently during the juvenile period, which is when it typically, an animal typically plays most in their life. So at the top of this curve here. And social species such as humans and dogs actually continue to play frequently as adults. So at some level over here, whereas non-social species will usually stop playing once they reach adulthood, which kind of gives some hints as to the mechanisms of play and why it's important. But I will go over that in a second. But first, just to kind of describe play in dogs, and also in other mammals, typically the literature divides these behaviors up into kind of 4 categories. The first is this non-social object play. So, you know, if a dog chases a ball or plays with a bone or something like that, it would constitute object play. Then there's this behavior called locomotor play, and locomotor play is whenever an animal is meeting the play criteria by just moving around in the environment. So a dog prancing through some snow, like pictured here, would be an example of that, or chasing their tail, something like that. Then the next category is social play, which is pretty self-explanatory. It's whenever a dog or any other animal is playing with another individual. This need not be a member of the same species. So for dogs, oftentimes their partner in play is a person and not even another dog, but it can even be a cat, for instance, in cat-dog households. And then finally, there is this last category, just called mixed play, which is basically any combination of the play behaviors you see before. So, dogs can play tug of war with one another, and so they're engaging in object play as well as tug of war. A dog could be carrying something as it swims through the water, and that would count as both object play and locomotor play. So mixed play is just really any sort of integrated behavior that involves one of these first three. And interestingly, play is relatively, it can be relatively rare in the animal kingdom, and it pops up in different locations. So if you look at this phylogenetic tree here, which is basically a map of the relationship between different animal groups that are alive today, if you look at the kind of part where these lines meet, that is what's known as a node. And that represents the last common ancestor of those animals before they diverged into different lineages. And so the last common ancestor of all animals is around here. And then last common ancestor of tetrapods, which basically just means mammals and amphibians and reptiles, et cetera, is right here. And what you can see is it's kind of rare among some of the fish species that you might be familiar with, or maybe present kind of sparsely. But after you move more into tetrapod territory, if you look at the black squares and the dotted squares, you see that play becomes much more common. But interestingly, since it was so rare earlier in history, perhaps it evolved multiple times independently, which is really interesting. And if you focus in on the placental mammals, which includes, your typical mammals that you might think of, like a dog or a person, there's a lot of play for sure. And in canids especially, you see a lot of play behaviors. So canids show all three forms of social play, or the building blocks of play that can become mixed play, or different different sorts of playful behaviors. And they'll do locomotor play, they'll do social play, as well as object play. And most canid species have been documented to do things like this. Even species like red foxes, for instance, which typically aren't too social as adults, but as juveniles, they will often play a lot. And of course, dogs are no exception to that. So why did play evolve? Does it have a purpose? Is it adaptive? And one idea that's out there that I think might be particularly convincing is this idea that it plays some role in neurodevelopment, or specifically neuroplasticity. So this just means that it might help the brain wire itself according to the environment, so that the animal can be adapted for the place in which it's raised. So a lot of these studies that have actually looked at this directly in the brain have been done in rodent models. And in particular, a lot of the literature is focused on an area of the brain called the prefrontal cortex. So just like in humans, the prefrontal cortex is at the top front of the brain, behind your forehead. And it's typically implicated in humans in decision-making, planning future behaviors, as well as social behaviors. So it's not too surprising that it's involved in play behavior. And there are these studies where people will try to figure out the effect of play behavior on the brain by essentially depriving one group of play behavior by isolating them socially, and then they'll allow another group to grow up normally. And of course, this isn't a particularly savory experiment, but it's something that is often done in rodent models. And what they find is basically that the animals that have play experience basically have more adult neuronal morphology. So the dots you see here are neurons. So neurons are kind of the individual cells in the brain that help process information. And they have kind of two stalks at either end. One's the dendrite, which receives signals from other neurons, and then the other one is the axon, which sends signals to other neurons. And it turns out that in these animals with play experience, they have these nice long-range dendrites that don't branch very much. And this is because their brain has pruned or removed excess connections that were present at birth to kind of narrow down that behavior to whatever's optimal in that environment. So basically they have more adult-like dendritic branches, or basically more adult-like circuitry or connections in their brain. Whereas the play-deprived animals have dendrites that branch all over the place, seemingly going to nowhere possibly, and they have fewer cell bodies as well. And perhaps this is because they aren't getting the play experience that is needed to properly tune this system towards, basically social play, which might also be important for other aspects of social behavior. And there's another study that also was of the same ilk. And basically they found the same sort of results, that you have these increased branches, which is basically a failing of pruning in the group with no social play. But interestingly enough, it didn't really matter if the rodent was only allowed to play with one other individual or multiple individuals. As long as they got a little bit of play behavior, they seemed to present as a normal animal. And unfortunately, experiments like this have kind of been done in domestic dogs in the past. One study that was done in 1971 was looking at the effects of isolation on puppies. And so they raised puppies in isolation until they were 5 weeks old. And by isolation, I mean that they weren't raised with other dogs or social peers. Instead, they were exposed to different stimuli in a standardized way. And they also had playtime, albeit short playtime sessions with an experimenter. So they had human input, they just didn't have any dog input, and they were hand raised as well. And they also had a control group. So in this picture here, the dogs labeled I are the isolated ones, and then the C is the control. And interestingly, they saw a couple of different fascinating things from this. One was that the isolated puppies, when reintroduced to other dogs and humans and objects, never performed social play, at first at least. So they were extremely uncomfortable around the other dogs. They didn't know how to interact. They preferred to be near other isolated dogs. They were less active in general. They were more afraid of new things and things like that. They looked at the brain waves of these dogs through EEG. So if you've ever seen a picture, or if you've ever had some electrodes put on your head, and it kind of looks like a crazy shower cap, that's what they did with these dogs while they were sleeping. And the reason why they did this is because EEG is a good activity, is a good indicator of the maturity of the brain. So it captures basically the electrical activity of all the neurons at the surface of the brain, sending signals to one another. And in adult brains, it has a particular regular pattern, as you see here on the left. So these handled puppies, these control puppies basically had a certain electrical signal that was very different from the handled puppies, which were more irregular and all over the place. And then this is the heart rate as well. And so their heart rates were also just more irregular. And the pattern of heart rate and brain waves kind of matches a stressed animal, which is unsurprising because they were suddenly being put into a completely different situation where they had to interact with other individuals. But luckily, the story has a happy ending. So after 7 days or so of intense socialization, these puppies basically recovered, and they had normal EEG waveforms after that, and they started to perform some social play. And basically, they pretty much fully recovered from the experience, which was a really nice thing. There was also another study that was actually done a bit earlier where they raised puppies in isolation through similar methods until they were actually 16 weeks old. And interestingly, once they started to have them interact with others and interesting objects and things like that, they found that they had abnormal or reduced object play. So at this point, if you isolate a dog until now, the dog will not be as interested in objects, which is really striking because dogs are famous for, playing with things. Like they're very neophilic, which means they like new things. They like to try out new things, especially young puppies, but these ones did not. Although they did do some social play, but mostly it was kind of unusual and it was kind of aggressive. So they had problems getting along with other dogs. They also, interestingly, had impaired learning ability. So if they had to learn rules and then the rules changed and they had to learn new rules, they weren't as good at it. And if they had to discriminate between things visually, they struggled with that a lot as well, much more than their control peers. And then interestingly enough, there were also breed differences. So they looked at beagles and fox terriers, and it turned out that the beagles were much more affected by this whole isolation paradigm, and they struggled to recover afterwards to a significant degree. But the terriers actually recovered after a couple of weeks and almost seemed like their normal controls. So it seems like something to do with the genetic background of the animal also contributes to whether they can recover from this sort of thing or not. But regardless, to say play is definitely important. And it turns out that it might also have been particularly important for dogs in the process of their domestication. So fascinatingly, dogs play with objects much more than wild canids. Even wild canids who are provisioned with toys in captivity typically don't play with them as much as dogs would do in the same situation. And then also dogs play cooperatively with their humans, which is something that even if you hand raise a wild canid like a wolf or a coyote, that they might not play with you as much like a dog would. And also in those previous studies, I forgot to mention that those dogs, even though they were socially deprived in their own species, would still play with humans. And so it seems like that, even if they didn't have much social context, so it seems like that's something innate about dogs, that they want to interact with people. Also, they play with each other more often in the presence of their humans. So if you have multiple dogs in your household, you might notice that they play with each other more when they want your attention or you happen to be in the room. At dog parks, this is also the case. So they're definitely using this behavior in some way to interact with people. And then a study by my advisor, Erin Hecht, in 2019, looked at brain variation across breed groups, and she found that the prefrontal cortex is distinct in companion and working dog breeds in relation to the rest of the brain. And like I mentioned earlier, the prefrontal cortex is heavily implicated in play behavior in rodents. So it's possible that they have undergone selection for play behavior, specifically companion dogs because they live in the household, and working dogs because play is actually a part of training in most modern programs. And also, dogs can be rewarded through playtime. So just like working dogs, if you have a ball-motivated dog or something like that, they actually find that playful interaction sometimes just as rewarding as getting food rewards. And that's something you would never see in a wild animal, for instance. And it turns out there are plenty of benefits of play for dogs. One because play is so social for dogs, and it actually helps them form stronger bonds with their humans. So there have been plenty of studies demonstrating that people who play with their dogs tend to have stronger connections. Although, I mean, this is really only a correlation rather than a causality, because we don't know if, playful dogs are just easier to play with, for instance, but there seems to be a relationship. Also, it allows for better social communication with other dogs. So as those deprivation studies showed, if they don't have interaction with other dogs and they're not able to play with other dogs, then they just won't know how to interact with other dogs. And this is something you might see, sometimes in shelter dogs who are in abusive situations, and when they move into a household, they have to get used to interacting with other dogs because that's very unusual for them. So it's very important to have this, and this is why people tell you to socialize your puppy as much as possible when they're young. It also improves emotional well-being because it's very rewarding, and it's a fun social activity. It also increases resilience to stressful things. So it's a good way to make your dog a little bit more level-headed and less fearful of strange things that they might encounter in their environment. It also improves motor coordination and strength because they're moving around. And then also, in addition to cognitive and brain development, it's also good enrichment for adults. And actually, in senior dogs, it can help stave off cognitive decline. So it's a very useful tool also at the end of a dog's life. And kind of as I touched on earlier, the brain and its anatomy is not just determined by genetics, but also by experience, and they interact with one another to create a brain that is either very playful or not very playful, as kind of demonstrated in those earlier deprivation studies. And so if you want a particularly playful dog, you might select a dog that genetically tends to be more playful on average. So you might choose a working or a companion breed or some other dog breed that's been proven by science to, on average, typically have greater play behavior. Or you might have a dog that you love, but maybe it's a breed that's not particularly playful, or maybe is a bit lazy. But what you can do is make a lot of effort to play with them when they're younger, introduce them to other dogs, try to figure out what they like, and you can play with them. And through this kind of feedback where you encourage play in the brain and the behavior happens, then it will strengthen those sorts of connections. And your dog will become more playful, which is very beneficial for, again, all of those reasons like cognitive enrichment, as well as emotional well-being and so on. And actually, play is useful from our perspective, from a scientific perspective, or from a pet parent's perspective, because you can actually learn a lot of things about your dog's internal state by watching how they play. Kind of, as I mentioned earlier, you can tell if your dog's particularly neophilic, which means they love new things, or maybe they're a bit more neophobic, so they're kind of scared of new things. So if your dog's scared, when you give them a ball, then maybe you should be more aware of that, aware of fearful behaviors when you do other things with them. But some dogs are just very confident and they love to play with new things. Another thing that you can glean from playing with your dog is seeing how collaborative or independent they are. So some dogs are just naturally going to be a bit more solitary with their play, maybe because of their genetic background, because of their breed, and some might become more collaborative just because of genetics, or perhaps you have a rescue dog, and depending on their life experience, they might be more independent or collaborative. But if your dog's particularly collaborative, that might be a good sign that you can actually train them using these toy rewards instead of treat rewards, which is sometimes nice because treats can quickly lead to heavy dogs. So it's a nice alternative. In addition, there are other things like seeing if your dog is stimulation seeking or relaxed. So some dogs just need a lot more interesting input from the environment to feel happy, just like some people. And so if your dog, really loves to play with toys and is all over them, then you might have a dog that, just needs a lot of stimulation. And maybe they're very high energy. They need to go for lots of runs, as well as maybe some cognitive enrichment as well. And then some dogs are just more relaxed and they could care less. So you have both ends of the spectrum. In addition to that, you can tell if your dog likes challenges or if they like things easy, just like some people. So especially for puzzle toys, some dogs really love puzzle toys and benefit a lot from them, whereas other dogs will either get kind of frustrated by them, or they will look to you for help, which also tells you that they use you as a social tool in their everyday life, but also kind of lets you know that maybe they don't like to be challenged all too much, whereas there are other dogs that just if you give them a puzzle, they'll play with it forever, just because it's super interesting to them. Also, you can look at laterality. So basically, laterality has to do with side preferences in the body. So just like humans are right-handed or left-handed, dogs can be left pawed or right pawed or somewhere in between. So if you watch how they play and you count up how they touch toys, you can get an idea of what maybe for that task, whether they're left preferent or right preferent. And actually there's some research connecting those two types of preferences to different emotional temperaments, and also working success in guide dogs in particular. So people are quite interested in that from a scientific perspective, but it can also be interesting to the public. And then finally, kind of as I touched on at the very beginning of this presentation, play behavior is just modified natural behavior or serious behavior for other things. And most of dog play behavior is very predatory in nature. It's part of their natural hunting instincts. And so if your dog, really likes to chase balls, they probably have a very strong prey drive, and you should be aware of that when you take them for walks, or maybe if you buy, a new small animal for your house. If your dog really likes to chase toys and tear up toys, you might have to think about carefully introducing them to the new animal. But of course, there are also other dogs who don't really have that, and they, are happy to just sit around small animals or toys and things like that, and they're not too bothered. And so those are just a couple of things that you can learn by watching your dog play. And so as a scientist, I'm also interested in all of those things. And because play seems to be potentially important from an evolutionary standpoint in general for mammals, but also in particular for dogs and their interactions with people, I am particularly interested in knowing how both genetic background as well as experience influence how dogs play with objects, so we can better understand when this sort of behavior occurs and how it can be modulated, because we know that play can be beneficial to dogs as well as their humans. And so there are many things that we're looking at with this study, including breed for the genetic background, also the history of selection of that particular breed, as well as that breed's neuroanatomy with existing brain scans that we have from different types of dogs, but also looking at basic life history, for instance, their sex, their age, their neuter status, whether they were rescued or not, or they just grew up, basically in a nice environment because they came from a breeder, for instance. Also their training experience, which might influence how they interact with objects or try to solve problems, their toy preferences, as well as their relationship with their human. And so basically in this study, we have people film very short videos of their dogs playing with toys. And pictured here are some of the dogs who have participated from our Instagram feed, and we often post little clips of them there. And basically the study just involves a couple of videos. So there's one video that's required, which is a familiar toy video. So just with your phone, you film your dog playing with one of their usual toys for 3 minutes without interacting with them or, you know, encouraging them to play. So this can be done when your dog is just naturally playing, you know, when you're sitting at home, or you might give the toy to your dog, but then just not encourage them further. And then we also ask for videos of your dog playing with one of these homemade puzzle toys. So because of the pandemic, we couldn't do this in the laboratory. So we had to figure out a way for people to create these puzzle toys that were, you know, could be easily made out of homemade objects, and that that would still give us interesting results. And so we kind of have two options that people can choose depending on what's easiest for them. One is this covered cup toy, which is basically just a cup with some treats in it. You put some paper towel or coffee filters or whatnot, tape it down, and the dog will try to get out the treats, or the dog will try to use you to get out the treats. And then there's also the tennis ball treat toy, which is basically a tennis ball with an X cut into it, so treats can be put inside, and the dog plays with the toy there. And the idea is that for this familiar toy, it's something that the dog is used to, and it captures the more naturalistic behavior that the dog does, perhaps not as, it's not as experimentally rigorous because there's a lot of variation in what sort of toys dogs are playing with and things like that, but at least it gives us a baseline for the individual. And then for these other two, we can directly compare them to other dogs in different households all over the world, and we can get an idea about how they solve problems, whether they look to people for help, if their behavior matches what we see with their regular toys, and so on. And so if you'd like to participate, we have a website where you can sign up. It's caninebrains.org/pawgames. We have 2 contact forms on the website that you fill out. And then we'll email you the instructions, which will also detail these exact steps, but I'll go over them here as well. So first you'll fill out a 3 to 5 minute intro survey so we can understand more about your dog's background. Then you film the videos with either your phone or a camera, and then you can submit them to us via Dropbox. We have a secure private folder, and then there'll be a final survey that's also 3 to 5 minutes where we'll just ask about kind of how the experimental process happened. And of course, since we're very grateful, we have a bunch of different rewards. One of them is this nice certificate of participation signed by me and my advisor, Erin Hecht, and your dog's name will go there. Another option is a virtual medal. So although we can't physically give out rewards, we can give these little stickers that go on your dog's posts. So it's kind of a cutesy way to show the world that your dog participated in this study. And then also we do social media posts where we'll tag and feature your dog's Instagram account or Twitter account, or your Instagram or Twitter, whatever the case may be, so that other people can see how your dog did, and you can look at how your dog did compared to others. And then also we have a raffle entry. So we have 3 $25 Amazon gift cards, and at the end of the study, we will randomly give them out. And the cool thing here is that if you do both experimental tasks, so you have both the covered cup game and then also the tennis ball treat game, then you get an extra entry. And if you have multiple dogs and you do it with all of them, then you get additional entries. So you can kind of stack your chances that way if you'd like. So the takeaways that I would like everyone to have now that we've reached the end of the presentation is that play is not just all fun and games. It's actually, in some ways, a very serious behavior that facilitates healthy neurodevelopment. It helps maintain the brain and improve cognitive abilities. It's at least partially heritable and has likely undergone recent artificial selection in certain dog breeds. And also the environment plays a huge role in play behavior. So it can always be modulated that way as well. Also play strengthens social bonds. So definitely play more with your dog if you have one. And also by observing play, we can learn more about dogs in our worlds, not just as pet parents, but also as scientists. And so play is a really wonderful way to learn more about dogs. So thank you for listening. Again, if you'd like to participate, go to caninebrains.org. And if you want to participate in paw games in particular, there's a /paw games at the end there. Also, I just want to quickly shout out our ongoing MRI study. So if you or someone you know has a dog that is from working dog bloodlines, for instance, a Labrador Retriever that's from working lines, or a Border Collie that's from working lines and their relatives herd, or if that dog in particular does work, we'd be really interested in having them participate in our MRI study. Because we are looking at neuroanatomical variation across different working dog breeds and how training actually influences the circuitries in their brain. Also, we have online surveys, if you'd like to do those, where we ask questions about your dog's temperament and life history. And if you'd like to follow any of this research, you can go to at canine_brains or my Twitter account, which is Sophie_A_Barton. I also have a website where I update some of the research projects I'm doing. And also, if you have any questions, there's our email at the bottom, so hectlab@fas.harvard.edu. And I'd be happy to chat to people more about this and answer any questions.
Okay, great. So thank you so much, Sophie. That was so fascinating. Just really quick before we jump into Q&A, I did drop the URLs. It's easier if it's easier to grab from the chat, feel free to grab the URL for the caninebrains.org and the paw game study specifically. And then I'll also drop the email for the Heck Lab. But I can also send these out later in a follow-up email so you guys have it. And I did want to say that if you do participate, feel free to tag Petminded as well in your videos. We'll reshare on your behalf, and hopefully it'll inspire more pet parents to participate. So Sophie can get a lot of great data points for her research. So I think we're starting to get questions. Christine wants to know, are MRI studies for purebred dogs? I'm assuming she means purebred dogs only.
Yes, for now that is the case. We are currently only interested in purebred dogs because we want to kind of investigate innate adaptations for certain behaviors. So for instance, innate adaptations in the Border Collie brain that allows them to herd. So we don't yet know how these sorts of adaptations hybridize in the brain. We don't know what the actual behavior produced by that is, which is why we're currently only looking at purebred dogs. But if you have a trained dog that does this specific behavior, we'd more than love to have them participate in either paw games because we're looking at training, or our behavioral surveys as well.
Great, thank you. So feel free to unmute yourself and ask a question, or drop your question in the chat. In the meantime, I'll just ask Sophie a few of my questions that came up during this excellent talk. Sophie, you mentioned that canids are one of the few, I guess, mammals who exhibit play behavior. Are there any theories about why that is the case?
So no, actually, plenty of mammals exhibit play behavior. It's within the canid family, you very consistently see all three types of play behaviors. So they're basically a very playful group of animals, even in ones that are perhaps less social, but especially in very social ones like wolves, African wild dogs, and things like that. And people think that this might be related to social bonding and maintenance of social relationships, especially in the more wolf-like canids that live in some form of social group, whether it's pairs or large groups like some wolves might, or African wild dogs. And because it kind of facilitates that communication aspect, it's a very kind of useful way for these animals to maintain those bonds.
Got it. Thank you for the correction. That's super helpful because I was like, I know dolphins and
no, totally.
Yeah. But I wasn't sure if scientists don't characterize that as play or, if there was something else going on there. So thanks for clarifying. So Richard wants to know, would you be interested in a dog participating in the study if he won't play with toys by himself unless they contain food? That was actually one of my questions because my dog's like that too.
Yeah, no, that's totally fine actually. So your familiar toy can be like a puzzle toy that you might have, like a Kong, or one of those mats that the dog will pull open slides on. So that's perfectly fine as well. When we actually analyze this data, we're going to group different types of toys separately, and so we can deal with differences that way. But we've definitely had dogs who only like playing with objects with food participate, and they played with their puzzle toys.
Awesome. Thank you.
I have a question. So Sophie, you were saying that play is maybe a precursor or training for hunting. So I wonder if you see differences in play between herding dogs and hunting dogs.
Yeah. So actually, surprisingly, not much work has been done on this. There has been a lot of work done looking at the general hunting motor sequence across different dog breeds. And it turns out that herding behavior is just modified hunting behavior. And so herding dogs are actually missing some of that sequence, like actual grab bites and, as gruesome as it is, kill bites on prey animals. Which is why they don't kill sheep when they herd them. And hunting dogs, like let's say maybe a beagle or a dog like that, which historically would have actually pursued prey and maybe also engaged with prey, especially dogs like greyhounds and whippets, which historically would actually kill their own prey. Those dogs have the full intact sequence that you would see in a wild animal. And it's possible that different play behaviors you see, like, when you throw a ball for a dog, for instance, might be related to how much of that sequence they still have. So, whippets love to chase things famously, and greyhounds as well. They'll chase cats and everything. And so they can be sometimes difficult to manage. And a dog like a livestock guardian dog that was bred to not have any hunting instinct, like a Great Pyrenees, probably isn't going to chase a ball quite as much just because they weren't bred for that. But we don't know yet if that's the case. And that's something that this study will be looking at.
It's funny you mentioned the whippets, because we have a whippet that's about a year old, and it seems to be intent on destroying all of the toys. And my daughter, who's 15, is buying him toys regularly. She's even in a club that sends you monthly toys in a box. And he just goes through them, and I wonder what it is that he's doing. But now you're making me wonder if those are actually kill bites in practice. And one of the big questions for me when he's biting me, should I do something to reciprocate so that he understands that his aggression is too high? Because we don't have a dog in the house right now. His first 6 months were with a very large dog, 130 pounds, and that dog didn't tolerate overly aggressive behavior, and now he passed away. So now this little dog has no feedback on what is too violent.
Yeah, no, that's really funny. I forgot to mention that also in canids, play behavior can be mock fighting behavior, which is also a, your dog might mouth you when they're playing with you. And a really cool way to reduce aggression or, bites that are too hard in that situation is to make a really high-pitched squeak when it happens. So something like, and if you do that, the dog will instinctively realize that it's basically bitten you too hard and they'll immediately let go. So this is a thing that you might observe in puppies playing, but it works in adult dogs, and I've done it with my own dog. Actually, my own dog used to live with a 170-pound Irish Wolfhound, and basically she became a very rough player because he was so big and he didn't really care. So I often do this with her sometimes when we play fight, but it's perfectly fine to reciprocate in that situation, but you can use the squeak technique if
I've
your
actually
fight is too
heard my
difficult.
daughter making that screeching sound, and I've reprimanded her, like when I'm doing a Zoom call, and she didn't tell me that she looked it up, but she must have. If
Yeah.
you're saying that it's a known
Mhm.
remedy. Thank you.
No problem.
That was
Sophie,
such a
can I
great
jump in?
question. I think we have a
Sorry.
few. Oh, Livia, go ahead. And then I'll take Sunny and Tina's. I'll read those off. Go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. I have a
Yeah,
quick question about the neuroplasticity and the difference that you see in like the play deprived dogs versus the dogs that experience play with like their brain, like their neurons and how they developed.
Mhm.
Do you how much of that do you think can be attributed to like a stress response? Like the dogs are just stressed that they haven't been around people and like with the social isolation versus like a lack of play itself.
No, I think it's definitely difficult to parse those two apart, and I think that they're actually tightly related. So something that you see in these dogs or dogs that are from abusive environments is that they are in a constant state of heightened arousal. So emotional arousal, meaning that they are just uncomfortable all the time. You know, when your heart's racing and you're sweating and you're just super stressed, and that's basically how they are all the time in these sorts of situations. And when an animal is stressed, they're not going to be very playful. But the problem is if they don't engage in play further, and interact naturally with the world and other individuals, then that's just going to be this positive feedback loop, and they might become eventually fearful of objects and other individuals completely. And if it occurs late enough in development, it could be permanent, or it might take a really long effortful time to kind of get that to get back to a kind of more normal interaction with the world. So I think it's definitely tied to stress in those situations. And that was also reflected by the fact that they took heart rate, and those heart rates were very irregular, very elevated, which is another classic sign of stress.
And then I guess a second question. So I have two dogs, and the first one, I got both, they're both dachshunds, and I've had both of them since they were about like 9 weeks old. But I do notice like they have a lot of similarities, but also some like really interesting differences in how they play and how they interact with like each other and even me. And I was just wondering if you have noticed or read about if that's like a real thing, like the fact that my first dog, I raised her, like it was just me and then like my boyfriend and her. So like she was like the only child, and like she grew up in that environment, like having to play just with humans. And like we would like take her to like meet dogs when she had her vaccines and stuff, and like we took her, like we carried her places, but she didn't have a lot of like dog interaction until like she was after that socialization period. Versus our new dog, she's like 5 months old and she's been raised in the house with the other dog. So is there any, like I guess I'm just wondering if there's like anything that you have read about that.
Yeah, so definitely in the deprivation studies, but also in some studies that have, retrospectively looked at how people have raised their dogs. There definitely seems to be a difference in social play behavior between dogs who, are kind of raised only with humans and dogs that also have a lot of dog experience. So dogs who, are only raised with humans, they actually struggle to communicate socially when they play because they never learned that. And so sometimes it's difficult for them to interact with dogs, that they might encounter at a dog park or on the street, because they just haven't developed that signaling. So a lot of play, especially in canids, relies on these reliable signals like a play bow or wagging tail or certain etiquette that basically allows dogs to know that the interaction is safe, and that even though they're pretending to do some behaviors, they're not actually going to hurt one another. And so if a dog doesn't reciprocate that properly, then it can be difficult for them to interact. It's just kind of like you can think of it like the stereotypical homeschool child who just, is a bit awkward because they're not used to that sort of social interaction. But that being said, you don't actually need that much social interaction with other individuals of your own species to actually come out with normal social play behavior. So in one of those classic deprivation studies, they would briefly expose these dogs to other dogs during their developmental social period, maybe like for 30 minutes a week. And that alone was enough for them to develop the natural response. So, I mean, depending on how much you introduce that particular dog to the outside world, like that might have played a role in that dog's current behavior. But also, some dogs just aren't as social anyway. So it could also be that.
Okay, so we have, I think Jill has a question, and then Tina and Sunny have quick questions as well. Jill, do you want to go ahead? And then we'll take Sunny and Tina's.
It's Gail, actually, who's with Jill.
Hi.
I just wondered, Sophie, have you noticed, is there a difference between the male and female dogs as to how they play as well? Is there a noted difference, particularly between the sexes?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's a really interesting question. And a lot of mammalian species there is, especially regarding play fighting behavior or like kind of rough and tumble play. So for instance, like in macaque monkeys or humans or rats, you typically see more of that style of play in males, but not in females. But interestingly, in canids, there isn't really a difference between males and females. Especially in dogs. And some people have hypothesized that this is because canids oftentimes live in monogamous social structures. So that means they have, one partner, and I guess you can kind of consider it as a bit more egalitarian in the fact that males and females don't have really different roles so much, and that females can, do most of the same behaviors. So in canids, you don't really see this, but also in general for domesticated animals like dogs, you typically don't see that sort of differentiation of play behavior according to sex. So yeah, dogs don't really show that, but other species do.
Thank you. It's actually a really interesting question. So our next question is from Sunny. She wants to know if you would be interested in super mutts / village dogs participating in your study. Her dog's DNA test came back with very limited to no traces of standard breeds.
Oh, that's very cool. I would absolutely be interested in that dog participating. I actually have a super mutt myself, so I'm particularly partial to them. But no, that would be super wonderful, especially since they, maybe are a village dog, and a lot of current research on dog domestication kind of follows this idea that dogs initially came to live with humans through this commensal relationship of living around human settlements and feeding off of scraps and things like that. So village dogs are super interesting from a scientific perspective as well, not just personal perspective, but I definitely love village dogs and super mutts.
Awesome. And I'll vouch that Cody plays really well. He has really come out of his shell in the past year because Sunny's been very patient with him. He's a rescue from a Korean dog meat farm.
Oh, I see.
He's doing really well. He's fun to watch on Instagram. Tina has a question / comment. Tina, do you want to ask yourself? I see you on video, but also I can ask for you. Nope. I'll ask for you. So Tina said she has a purebred dog who isn't registered, no pedigree, but is a highly trained working dog. And he's a service dog. He is a herding breed, ACD. They've been playing language comprehension games since he was 8 weeks old. Wow. He counts to 6 now, matches shapes, and is learning to visually recognize/read printed words. He also has an odd toy building behavior. I feel like now you have to unmute and tell us what this building behavior is.
So he has a jolly ball. It's like a bigger, like a 8 or 10 inch ball. It's on a rope. And he started it when he was 7 months old. He like the discs or the frisbees that he has that has a hole in them, he lays the rope out flat and then puts the disc over the top of the rope, reaches through the hole and grabs the rope. And I've caught him with 2 at a time on there. And it's so that he can pick them all up and carry them around.
Wow. I've never heard of anything like that in dog play before, and I would definitely love to see videos of that. He's a beautiful dog, by the way, and we're definitely interested in having dogs that have a lot of training experience. You know, it could just be with you know, tricks, or it could be, you know, extensive language comprehension games like you do with your dog, or, you know, a service dog as well, and oftentimes, working dogs or, you know, highly trained dogs tend to be purebred dogs. So it's super useful to us to have a dog that's not necessarily purebred, so we can kind of pull apart, you know, what part of this is maybe driven by breed versus the training experience. So I would absolutely love your dog to participate. What's his name, by the way?
It's Boba, but it's Boba, like not the T, it's Star Wars, Boba Fett.
Oh, Boba Fett. I love it.
Yeah. Yeah, he has a really extensive understanding of English, of the English language, spoken English language. Like he can answer yes, no questions by either touching cards or buttons. Can I have it, buddy? Bring it. And his father he travels a lot. So we go back and forth to the airport. So just traveling, we would talk about the loud things like motorcycles that would go by. So I can ask him, like, is that a school bus? And show like a video of a motorcycle and he'll tell me no. Or like we have a video online of him. I asked him, was an airplane a school bus? And he said no. And I asked him, is it an airplane? And he said yes. So it's kind of, he's creepy smart. It's weird. It's weird. It's weird. It's too, like,
yeah.
People don't understand. Yeah, I don't understand it, but I think it's just like the neuroplasticity thing that you discussed. Like I trained him as a service dog. So when I got him, I was sick, or if it was a rainy day, and he's a high energy dog and needs mental stimulation. So we just played like toddler made up comprehension games. Can I have it? That's too loud. Can I have it? Thank you. And I think it made too many neural connections.
Yeah, there's actually a body of literature in like the dog cognition world, looking at learning different object names and using these sorts of symbolic representation tasks or language understanding tasks, especially in border collies and other herding breeds. And there are some dogs like Boba who are just really, really good at these sorts of tasks. So yeah, it would be really interesting to see how he plays, especially that interesting play behavior that you mentioned.
Okay, awesome.
Okay, so I know we went over by a few minutes, but if anyone has one last question, feel free to speak. Otherwise, we can go ahead and start closing things out. Okay, it looks like we're good. Awesome. Sophie, thank you so much. This was fascinating and also maybe one of the most fun talks that has been given at Petminded. So thank you so much. I got a lot of personal messages in the chat where people said they're having a great time and they're learning so much. So I really, really appreciate it on behalf of the community. And for those who are still here, I'll share all the information to get in touch with Sophie about the study, but also the lab. And please participate. I think it would be so cool if we could all contribute to this research. And Sophie, I'd love to have you come back after you have analyzed your data and see what you learned. Is there anything you would like to close out with?
No, just thank you so much for this opportunity. It was really fun making this presentation and talking to everyone. And there were some really great questions, which I always love to answer. So yeah, thank you everyone for listening. And if you want to participate, remember caninebrains.org/pawgames.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. And folks, we're doing a few events next week that I want to shout out for National Pet Week. There's one on treating cancer. We're bringing in a scientist to talk about this gene editing technology that he developed in grad school and now has founded a company. We also have a biocultural anthropologist who's going to talk about this phenomenon called pet parenting and what that means for us and also for our pets. And then last but not least, we have Lily Chin, who is this, she just published this best-selling book called Doggy Language, which we talk about at almost every event for Petminded. It's an illustrated book of dogs in different poses demonstrating what their body language means. Super affordable, great way to get to know your dog. And she does not pay me to say that. I'm genuinely a really, really big fan. So she's coming back to do a chat with us on Friday. So if you guys are interested, please sign up. We'd love to see you. And thank you so much again for coming tonight. Have a good night and good rest of your day to the folks in New Zealand. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks.
Bye.